Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fast Food Fights. What can we learn from the news about fast food land use policies? I'm Pamela Mejia with the BMSG research team, that's Berkeley Media Studies Group, and I'm so delighted that you're all joining us today. I think we have a lot of exciting information to share, and I'm hoping you'll agree. Before we start, I want to take care of a few logistical housekeeping issues. First of all, if you have any technical problems, anything that you need help with as regards the technology itself, please contact WebEx at 1-866-229-3239. That number should be up on your screen. Again, 1-866-229-3239. Now, we are very excited to hear everyone's feedback and make this as engaging and interactive as is possible. So I want to direct your attention to the chat feature of WebEx. And you can use this feature, which should be down at the bottom of your screen. You can come take a look here at the slide for an image. And you can use that a couple different ways. You can use it to let us know if you have any technical issues. So sound quality, anything like that. If you want to let us know about technical issues, you'll need to select host from the panel, from the drop-down menu up at the top. If you have a question, you can also use the Q&A function or the chat function. And for that, you'll just need to select from the drop-down menu whoever you want that question to be directed to. So if you want it to go to all of the panelists who are here joining us today from Berkeley Media Studies Group, Public Health Advocacy Institute, and ChangeLab Solutions, you select all panelists. If you want it to go to all participants, please select that grouping. But if you have a specific question for one of our panelists, Mark, Heather, or Laura, please direct that to them. Of course, we want people, in the interest of engagement, if you feel like you want to tweet anything about this webinar, about your experiences with it, thoughts, questions, anything that comes up, please use the hashtag on your screen. That's hashtag FastFoodFights. And we'll be trying to monitor that as much as possible and follow up with anybody who's interested via Twitter or anybody who raises questions that can't be answered during today's seminar with that hashtag. All right. So with that said, if there's no other questions, I don't see anybody sending any technical issues to me, so I'm going to assume you can all hear me and are as excited to get started as I am. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to our first presenter, Laura Nixon. Laura is a media researcher with Berkeley Media Studies Group and is the lead author on the work that we're going to be talking about today. So with that said, Laura, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Pam. And just to give you all an overview of what we're going to be doing today, I'm going to be talking through some of our findings, and then we're going to be hearing from Mark from the Public Health Advocacy Institute and Heather Wooten from ChangeLab Solutions about some of their thoughts and ideas about going forward. And I wanted to encourage everyone that to please, if you have questions while I'm going through any of my slides, to go ahead and put that into the chat box. The other panelists will be monitoring that and letting me know if there are any burning questions about any of the data or there are questions that are coming up, and we'll be doing that. Oh, and I should mention that after we've all spoken, there will be a time for question and answer. And you can type your questions in at any time. You don't have to save it up for the question and answer session. And before I talk about our findings, I just wanted to say a quick word about Berkeley Media Studies Group and what we do. We do three main things. We research news coverage of public health issues, and that's what we'll be talking about today. But we also do media advocacy training and strategic consultation to help people in public health engage effectively with the media, and we also do some professional education for journalists. Now, we got interested in this topic of fast food land use policies because of some of the high-profile examples of this, like South Los Angeles. That first picture on the left that you see on the screen is a picture from South Los Angeles. And as you can see, it's a community that is really blanketed by fast food restaurants. And people in the public health community, as many of you probably know, have really highlighted land use policies such as zoning as a promising approach to creating healthier communities. And that was certainly the case in South Los Angeles. The main intent of that policy, which was first a moratorium and then some permanent restrictions on fast food restaurants in South Los Angeles, was definitely to improve community nutrition and create a healthier food environment. But we also knew that those weren't the only types of fast food land use policies that happened. And so you can see in this second picture, this is Bristol, Rhode Island. And just a few years before South Los Angeles, they had also passed a fast food land use policy. But it was for a very different purpose. And as you can see, it's a very different type of community. It's very picturesque. There's not a lot of fast food there. And so we knew that there were these different types of policies being passed, and we wanted to know, first of all, what is the universe? Where have these types of policies been passed? What's happened to them? How successful have they been? But also, how have they been debated? And so to that end, we had two main questions. We wanted to know, first, how does the news coverage depict fast food land use policies? And how does it differ based on the purpose of the policy and where it's proposed? So kind of looking at those two pictures, we wanted to know, do the debates look different? What is the difference in the news coverage? What's the difference in the outcomes of these policies based on these different factors? And in order to explore that, we did three main things. First, we analyzed the newspaper coverage. So we looked at newspaper and blog articles. And in order to do that, I should mention that we had to first figure out which communities had even passed these policies. And we were looking at this from 2001 to 2013. And so Lissy and Mark at the Public Health Advocacy Institute did a great job of helping us to track down and looking for all of the legislative history for local policies all across the country. So we looked at the newspaper coverage for each of those. We collected statistics so that we could have a sense of the demographics and different characteristics of the types of communities that were proposing these. And as I mentioned, we looked at the legislative histories. We were looking at the proposals themselves, the ordinances, as well as meeting agendas and minutes to get a sense of how these proposals were being talked about. And ultimately, we found that there were 77 communities that had proposed land use policies that restricted fast food in some way. Some of them were specifically about fast food outlets. So you can see in the first bullet point, some of them were specifically about fast food outlets, but some were about drive-throughs or formula businesses. Formula businesses is another way of saying chain stores or chain businesses. And so those were ones that didn't specifically name fast food, but fast food restaurants would be affected by those policies, either intentionally or unintentionally. And there were quite a number of policy strategies that were used. The most common, the majority of these policies were some type of permanent ban on fast food restaurants or these other types of businesses, either in the entire town or just in one area of the town, for example, the historic downtown or some area. But we also saw temporary bans and some other restrictions like, fast food restaurants can't open within 500 feet of a school, that kind of a thing. And I should mention that there were 77 communities, but because several of the communities had multiple proposals or multiple policies, there were actually 100 total policies that we looked at. And Next, I'll talk you through a little bit about what these communities looked like. So as you can see, they have been, this is just a little map of from 2001 to 2013 where these policies were proposed, and you can see it's coast to coast. And in that first slide where we saw those two pictures, you get a sense that there is quite a wide range of where these, what kinds of communities these policies are being proposed in. And in fact, the biggest community where it was proposed was New York City with 8 million, and the smallest was a little town in Utah of 500. But what we found when we looked at this is that, in fact, most of the communities looked a lot more like that second picture. They looked a lot more like Bristol, Rhode Island than South Los Angeles. So they were very small. More than half had a population of less than 20,000. And in fact, about 40% had a population of less than 10,000. So we're talking about very small communities. Most of them were majority white communities, and a lot of them had incomes that were higher than the national average and fairly low poverty rates. And we also found that in terms of the policies, most of the policies were not intended to improve nutrition. So I mentioned before that there were 100 policies. Of those, only 20 had any kind of mention either in the news coverage or in the legislative histories or their ordinances themselves about using this policy to improve community nutrition. But and so when I talk later, as I talk about later on in the next slides, when we talk about nutrition policies versus non-nutrition policies, when I talk about nutrition policies, I'm talking about those 20 policies that were to improve community nutrition, whereas the 80 other ones that didn't have a mention of nutrition are what we think of as the non-nutrition policies. And we found some very interesting differences in terms of comparing what kind of communities were the nutrition policies and the non-nutrition policies proposed in, what kind of news coverage did they get, how successful were they, and what types of policies were they, what was the mechanism. The first big difference that we found is in terms of the types of communities where nutrition policies were proposed. Nutrition policies were mostly proposed in communities of color. You can see on the left here, in the majority white communities, there were far more majority white communities that proposed fast food land use policies, but there were only a handful of them were about nutrition. We also found that communities where nutrition policies were proposed were more likely to be poor. They were larger, more urban, more dense. And so in the next slide, we'll look at the outcomes of these nutrition policies. So nutrition policies were both weaker and less likely to pass. And by weaker, I mean that the type of policy tended to be weaker. So I had mentioned before that we looked at three main categories of policies. We looked at permanent bans, temporary bans, and then other restrictions. So nutrition policies tended to be in those last two categories. They tended to be temporary, or they tended to be a restriction that fell short of a full ban. And in spite of this, even though the policies themselves were weaker and less restrictive, they were also less likely to pass. So you can see below that 35% of nutrition policies passed versus nearly 80% of the non-nutrition-based policies. And we found that nutrition policies were also subject to more critical news coverage. People were, the balance of quotes, the balance of opinions about these policies were much more likely to be negative in the case of nutrition policies. And we found that nutrition policies were less likely to be supported by community residents and local business owners when they appeared in the news. They were much more likely to speak against nutrition policies. And so this is a big overview of what the news coverage looks like. And now we're going to dig into what did the news coverage of these two different types of policies really look like? And the first thing we'll look at is, what did people say in support of the policies? So when we looked at arguments that were pro-regulation, that were in support of these types of land use regulations, unsurprisingly, the ones about nutrition, really the main focus was it was about health. And this is a really characteristic quote from a councilwoman saying, obesity is an epidemic and we need to take a stand against fast food. On the other hand, when the policy wasn't about nutrition, the two main arguments that we saw in the news coverage were that the importance of protecting community aesthetics or appearance and also local businesses. And so there was a coffee shop owner in a small town in Northern California called Benicia that says, Benicia has this small town atmosphere and they're ruining it by allowing these businesses to come in. And we found that, in fact, oftentimes this idea about protecting appearance was kind of woven into the local economy because many of these smaller towns had, historic downtowns, they had a lot of tourism, and so they were concerned about protecting their appearance in order to protect their economy and to protect the tourist economy. Now, so this is on the sort of the people who were arguing for the policies, but we also saw some really interesting differences in terms of people arguing against the policies and how that looked different based on whether the policy was being framed in terms of nutrition. And what we found is that when the policy was about nutrition, the main argument being made against these policies in the news was that it was government intrusion, that this was about government reaching in and telling people what to do. So, for example, this was a quote from the California Restaurant Association saying, "What's next? Security guards at the door saying you're overweight, you can't have a cheeseburger." And we saw several variants of this as well. Particularly in South Los Angeles, the debates around their policies, there was quite a bit of language about race. There was one of our favorite quotes was talking about, that the councilwoman Jan Perry, who proposed that policy, thinking that they needed to slap fast food out of the hands of Black and brown people. And there was also a lot of language about that we sort of thought of as a little bit as racially coded. It wasn't explicitly about race, but, for example, one quote was that one person said about the policy in South Los Angeles that, well, you have to teach these inner city kids how to eat or else they'll find the unhealthy foods even if they're not in a fast food restaurant. And so those were some of the sort of variants that we saw about this government intrusion argument. But when we looked at the policies that weren't about nutrition, it was a very different picture. We really didn't see any arguments about government intrusion. And when there were arguments about government intrusion, about policies not about nutrition, it was more about, well, this is impeding the free market. Instead, what we saw with policies that weren't about nutrition was this is bad for the economy. And, for example, this is another California town up in Northern California, and a council member saying bans and regulations do not lead to prosperity. And this is a pretty representative quote of what we saw in terms of the arguments against policies that weren't about nutrition. And so this brings up a few sort of preliminary conclusions that we highlight in our paper and that I want to talk about a little bit now. And the first is just that point from the last slide that when there was the health framing, it seemed to trigger this government intrusion argument from opponents. And that was something that we really didn't see when the policy wasn't about health. And that really raised for us the question of what would be the possible value of emphasizing the non-nutrition co-benefits of these policies. So even if the core goal is to improve community nutrition, would it be worthwhile to emphasize some of the other co-benefits that might come from a policy, such as improving the appearance of a neighborhood or encouraging local businesses or or reducing nuisances like litter, noise, and traffic. And so that was definitely a question that was raised for us from these findings. But we also knew that, as I mentioned before, the communities where these policies were proposed were very different. There was really a wide range, and so I think it really is an open question of whether some of those arguments that were really successful in small towns that may have a tourist economy, may have a historic downtown, those arguments about improving appearance and reducing nuisance for neighbors, how would those play out if they're applied to more urban communities that already have lots of fast food restaurants? And another point that I just wanted to draw out is also the way that race and class may shape the debate around these policies. As I mentioned before, particularly when we were looking at government intrusion and also arguments about whether the policy would work or not, we did see quite a few references to race and class in terms of particularly about, as I mentioned, is this government intrusion towards communities of color or towards low-income communities, and would these types of policies even be effective given that all of the other barriers that low-income communities face? And so I think that this is another really important aspect to keep in mind as we consider these findings. And to that end, we wanted to ask all of you in the audience a quick question. And our poll question is, should public health advocates emphasize the co-benefits of fast food zoning policies? So as I mentioned, improving appearance or reducing nuisances. And so our host is going to queue up that poll now, and I believe it's right there. And you can go ahead and enter your answers. So I'll give you just a few seconds to do that.
You should all be seeing a poll question underneath the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen.
And it looks like people are still responding. Some are switching their answers. So this is Heather, your host. I'll just allow a few more moments for people to make their selections.
All right. And I wanted also to invite people that as we know we're forcing you to fit yourself into one of the three categories, but this is also just to open up conversation. So if you have thoughts, if you're a maybe perhaps, or if you feel strongly about your yes or no, we just encourage you to write into the chat box about what your thinking is about this.
So looks like our poll has ended. I'm not seeing too many additional comments at this point. So while we're kind of assessing the answers to that and finding out a little bit more, I see an overwhelming majority here at 68% said yes. So I think that is a pretty good pivot to our next presenter and our next aspect of the conversation. So I want to thank Laura for doing a great job of walking us through the public conversation. We can consider it, what the news says about these policies and the reactions to them. I think that gives us a really good window into how the public and how the policymakers who read and follow news are understanding these issues. And now we're going to pivot to Heather Wooten of Mark Gottlieb of the Public Health Advocacy Institute, who's going to talk us through some other nuances and take us a little deeper into that conversation and into what it means for the policy implications of this strategy. So Mark, take it away. And as always, please feel free to contribute your questions, insights at any point through the chat box.
Legal and policy, where we use legal and policy research and advocacy, including litigation.
Mark, I apologize for interrupting. It looks like you were on mute, so if you could back up to the beginning of your presentation and start again.
I hope I can be heard now.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Oh, very good. Hi, it's Mark Gottlieb from the Public Health Advocacy Institute. We use legal and policy research and advocacy, including litigation, to improve public health, and we're based at Northeastern University School of Law in Boston. And I'll be very brief here. I just wanted to share a few thoughts about the legal and regulatory impact, potentially, of and their implications from these findings that Laura shared with us. I mean, I think a lot of this comes back to the nanny state problem. You know, since the 1970s in the U.S., personal responsibility rhetoric and arguments have increasingly been dominating the public policy debates, particularly around public health interventions. Rugged individualism and self-reliance are powerful American themes, and they present social problems, including public health problems, as a matter of personal choice that's independent of social or environmental forces. And so this leads to these cries of nanny statism, often by stakeholders, in response to virtually any legal or regulatory policy directed at improving public health. We've all had to deal with this, and I think that's the dynamic that is at play here. All too often, these are very effective arguments and a way of framing the issue in a very negative light that often results in legislative failure in the case of zoning ordinances. The news quotes that Laura had shared illustrated how these arguments play out in news coverage, and they are powerful. So what are the ways around this? The problem I see is that communities that need restrictions on fast food density the most are the least likely to get it, with the notable exception of South Los Angeles and its moratorium. Government action that's based on health concerns falls into this nanny state trap and become easily lambasted. And you know, of course, we know this isn't the right approach. These arguments are basically rhetorical devices that are designed to impede public health policy. And we know that, you know, government action around public health protects our food, has provided drinking water, public drinking water, and sewage treatment, and you know, helps prevent the spread of disease. These are all, you know, important, critical things that that public health policy at the government level provides, but they're all, I guess, examples of nanny statism. But it's very difficult for us, particularly if you're thinking about in the context of a zoning argument, or excuse me, a zoning ordinance, to make these counter arguments from a defensive posture successfully. So, short of changing society's views on what the role of government is, how can zoning have a larger impact on improving the food environment where it's needed most? Because as we see that the most affluent and generally white communities are the ones where this has been a successful legislative policy strategy. So adoption of zoning rationales that emphasize improving the business environment rather than improving the health environment may be the best near-term solution. They can be sensitive to and make reference conceivably to positive health impacts and culture of health which promotes wealth. But front and center, it seems that improving the business environment is the most likely strategy to be successful. And if you look at the actual ordinance in South Los Angeles, the rationale they give is not about reducing health disparities and reducing or responding to the obesity crisis. What they say is their goals and objectives listed in the community plans address the need to provide a strong and competitive commercial sector which serves the needs of the community, attract uses which strengthen the economic base and expand market opportunities for existing and new businesses, enhance the appearance of commercial districts, and identify and address the overconcentration of uses which are detrimental to health and welfare of the people in the community. So they make reference to health, but mostly they're emphasizing improving the economic base in the community. They continue in the rationale legislative preamble, whereas there is an overconcentration of fast food restaurants in the South Los Angeles region, as shown in recent reports, which found that 45% of the 900 restaurants in South LA are fast food outlets. And whereas fast food restaurants typically have a standardized design that is out of context with the neighborhood, in addition to excessive signage or little or no landscaping, large expanses of surface parking, drive-through windows, blah, blah, blah. They're going into the aesthetics, and they're focusing on improving the business environment, which in fact are the strategies that seem to be the most successful according to our study. So the Los Angeles's rationale resulted in this one-year moratorium on fast food restaurants, and it was historic, largely because this was, first of all, because it was not in a community with 500, population of 500, but it was a community where such a moratorium could have a public health impact and an opportunity to reduce health disparities. It was a moratorium where one was really needed. And advocates could seize on this in order to build support, but the ordinance itself was largely health neutral, and I think that's very important, that the zoning ordinance really ought to be health neutral to avoid getting shot down as an example of government overreach. So this provided an alternative and official rationale that successfully, in this case, avoided some of the nanny state argumentation, although it certainly was there. You couldn't point to anything really in the ordinance. And, you know, health advocates may want to consider partnering with community development stakeholders to encourage them to take a leadership role in efforts to reduce the fast food density through zoning laws, rather than having this health advocates be out front on this. They can be supportive, but this is maybe a situation that would benefit from that sort of partnership in order to, as this picture suggests, knocking down some of this fast food landscape that really litters communities that need high nutrition and good food options rather than more fast food. And I'm going to hand this back now to Heather, and then we will hear from Heather Wooten from ChangeLab Solutions.
Hello, everyone. Sorry for the little pause there. My name is Heather Wooten, and I'm Vice President of Programs at ChangeLab Solutions. where we partner with state and local leaders to create healthy communities using the tools of law and policy. So following up on Mark's presentation, I'm here to make the case that if we want to build healthy neighborhoods, fast food does matter. And local policies can provide us with useful tools for bringing a healthy balance to our food environments. Take a look at this map. Anyone have any idea about what the pinpoints of light represent? If you have a guess, I would love if you could share it with us over in the chat window, and I'll come back to this in a minute. But first, let me share some research looking at just how prevalent fast food is in our communities. The image you're seeing here is a graphic representation of the findings from a study that looked at the mix of food retail in California by retailer type. And here you can see that retailers with healthier options available, like supermarkets, produce stores, and farmers markets, make up respectively 14%, 3%, and 2% of all food retail outlets in the state. The next largest slice of our retail landscape pie comes from convenience stores, which are not known for their fresh or healthy offerings unless someone has discovered something about Twinkies that I don't yet know. But the biggest piece of the pie by far, at about 56% of retailers, are fast food restaurants. And I want you all to think about this. So when you walk out your door in the morning, you're passing 4 times as many unhealthy food stores as healthy food stores. And in Chicago, a similar study found that your relative food environment is different depending on your race. Here we can see that African Americans had about twice the relative access to fast food than to a grocery store. Other studies have looked at this relationship closely between fast food and, in particular, places that kids visit. So these studies have found, for example, that more than a third of middle and high schools nationwide are located within a half mile of at least one fast food outlet or convenience store, and that 2/3 of urban secondary schools have at least one fast food restaurant within walking distance. So one response to this might be to encourage more healthy food outlets to open up, right? If we're trying to bring our food environment into balance, we just need more of the good stuff. And I think we're seeing a little bit more acceptance or support for the incentives for healthier food options when we look at policies that are being proposed and passed around the country. And those are often using health rationale. They're saying people need to have access to healthy food. So if we have this interest from policymakers and it's an easier route to just say bring in more of the good stuff, why do we keep talking about limiting fast food? Well, let me show you a great study that I found particularly interesting when I came across it. So many of us probably know the old saying, you know, weight is affected by 2 things, calories in, calories out. It's this balance equation. But the truth might be more complicated and is definitely going to be less politically palatable. So this study, which was reported in the New York Times, looked at how many calories a group of people living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle were burning in comparison to relatively sedentary Western folks. And the technique that they use calculates the body's rate of carbon dioxide production. It's a very specific way to measure calories burned that was a lot more precise than the estimates people had been using in the past. So they did this study with the Hadza people who live in Tanzania in a place without electricity or running water, and they live a lifestyle that's very similar to what our hunter-gatherer ancestors would have done. So a typical daily routine involves traversing miles of hilly terrain and foraging for food like tubers, berries, or other wild food plants. And that's often, by the way, while carrying infants, firewood, and water. And men set out alone most days to collect honey or to hunt for game using handmade bows and arrows, and they often cover about 15 to 20 miles a day. So tell me, what do you guys think? Did the Hadza people burn more calories than their sedentary Western counterparts with our computers and our webinars? I would love to hear your guess in the chat window. Okay, here's the result. They found that despite all that physical activity, the number of calories the Hadza burned per day was indistinguishable from that of the typical adults in Europe and the United States. And the researchers suspect this is the case because they believe that the Hadza the Hadza's bodies are actually adjusting to higher activity levels required for hunting and gathering by expending less energy elsewhere. They sort of talk about the amount of calories we burn in the background, just our bodies, making cells and doing all the other good things that we do besides walking around. So here's how the study's author ended the article. All of this means that if we want to end obesity, we need to focus on our diet and reduce the number of calories we eat, particularly the sugars our primate brains have evolved to love. We're getting fat because we eat too much, not because we're sedentary. Physical activity is very important for maintaining physical and mental health, but we aren't going to jazzercise our way out of the obesity epidemic. If we're surrounded by more junk food than our bodies could ever hope to burn off, it's probably no wonder we're seeing epidemic levels of overweight and obesity. And studies have shown a strong evidence of association between frequent eating of fast food, excess energy intake, weight gain, overweight, and obesity. The typical calorie content of menu items like French fries and soft drinks has increased about 35% since the 1970s, and it's common for restaurants to serve 2 to 3 times more than what's considered a standard serving size. We also see that nearly 1/3 of U.S. children between the ages of 4 to 19 eat fast food every day, and students with fast food restaurants that are located within a half-mile of their school consume fewer servings of fruits and vegetables, more servings of soda, and were more likely to be overweight or obese than were youths whose schools were not near fast food restaurants. Okay, so let's go back to this map. I did see a correct guess come in. Maura suggested that this was McDonald's locations in the U.S., and she's absolutely right. So this map is a visualization as if every McDonald's in the U.S. were bright spots of light shining up into space. And you can look at this and spot our major cities. You can spot our interstate freeway system. This map is us. I doubt the folks who envisioned our current auto-dependent transportation system imagined that they were subsidizing fast food while they were laying down asphalt from sea to shining sea. But public policy has definitely played a role in shaping our food environments in many ways. So if the outcome of our food landscape is that it is designed for disease, as this study found, what can we do about it? You see here these findings that are suggesting that low-income communities of color where we have higher ratio of fast food restaurants and convenience stores to grocery stores have higher prevalence of obesity and diabetes. But it's not, that argument is not working in the media. I'm here to say that both market forces and public policy do have a role to play in this equation. And as we've heard today, communities are using public policy as a tool to create more balanced food environments, where healthy options are hopefully at least as accessible as unhealthy ones by using zoning or other land use regulations to limit fast food or chain restaurants. But it's the minority that are using that health rationale. So here, I'm a city planner, and you guys know this saying, right? When you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So when you're a city planner, everything looks like a zoning issue. The problem is, like a hammer, zoning is a pretty blunt instrument for creating healthy food environments. It's really not a great tool for distinguishing between fast food restaurants that offer healthy items from those that don't, which, there are a few out there that are trying it. It's definitely not the best tool for getting existing fast food restaurants out of communities that find themselves oversaturated, but it is one of the tools we need to be thinking about and using if we want to build neighborhoods that are designed for health and not for disease. So to that end, I wanted to make sure you knew about some resources that might give you a leg up in this healthy food zoning process. ChangeLab Solutions has created a library of model policies and toolkits, including our model zoning ordinance to limit fast food restaurants near schools. I suspect that talking about children and the health of children is a more palatable argument and has the possibility to deflate the tyranny of choice argument and the nanny state conversation, because we really are responsible for protecting our kids and helping them grow up to be healthy adults. We also have a another set of resources that you might be interested in, which is we have a toolkit on creating healthy restaurant programs. So if you want to work with restaurants in a voluntary capacity to encourage them to have healthier items on their menus, this toolkit has lots of ideas for doing that. And then back on the regulatory side, we have a couple of different ordinances that deal with children's meals. We have one that's a model for setting nutrition standards for kids' meals that come with a toy. We also have an ordinance that takes out that toy component and just says flat out establish nutrition standards for kids' meals. And we have a couple other ones that are specifically designed to limit sugar-sweetened beverages, which is, I think, an important part of this equation. So these resources and many more are available on our website, and I will happily participate in the Q&A with my fellow panelists. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much to our fantastic panelists that we had the pleasure of working with on this project and talking with today. So with that in mind, we have about 15 minutes left, and we wanted to open the time up, the remaining time up for some questions and question and answer. So to start the ball rolling, I'm going to introduce a question that one of our fine participants raised that I think is a really interesting one. Robin Dean, who's with us today, spoke about, she said the health framing worked well in the Berkeley soda tax campaign. It triggered the government intrusion argument, but that argument didn't hold sway. So how do we explain Berkeley's framing working so well? Was it the anti-big business frame? Was it Berkeley's demographics? So I thought this was a really interesting question, and I wanted to open it up to the broader audience. For those of you who don't know, which I imagine in this group is not many people, Berkeley recently passed, actually just last November, passed the country's first soda tax for purposes of health. And that was the aftermath or the result of a very, very impressive campaign that was called Berkeley versus Big Soda, and that focused on addressing the health harms of soda and the actions of the soda industry against the tax in the interest of implementing a citywide tax to ultimately raise funds for community programs and health, community health programs, excuse me. So with that context in mind, Robin is bringing up this very interesting point about how the health argument in this context didn't successfully trigger the government intrusion frame. So does anybody have any thoughts or ideas that they want to share about maybe why some of that worked or didn't work?
Sure. Well, I can start off. This is Laura, and I think that I think that it's a really fascinating issue, kind of campaign, and actually Berkeley Media Studies Group will be doing a news analysis of the Berkeley soda tax, so we're very excited to dig into that. And yeah, I think that I don't have any particular basis for thinking this, but that I think that the fact that, because it felt like there certainly was a health argument, but even the tagline of the campaign, Berkeley versus Big Soda, that wasn't a health argument. That was a we need to do something about the soda industry argument. And that was something, I live in Berkeley, and so that was certainly something that I heard. I was actually talking with someone who's not in public health, and she said to me, well, I have my issues with the ordinance, but I sure hope we kick Big Soda out of town. And I think that was sort of a great encapsulation of really the focus of the campaign. So that was something that I noticed, and I think that, and that may apply here in terms of zoning, that health was certainly the main reason why the soda tax was being implemented. It was something that people were talking about, but the main focus of the campaign wasn't that health. There was sort of this other focus as well.
Can I jump in on that one too? I mean, I think we are seeing more and more cities getting interested in proposing soda taxes, and Berkeley was a successful kind of first entry in that field. But I would just point out that, you know, a soda tax doesn't stop people from drinking soda. It raises the price, and it puts those funding, that funding towards hopefully strategies that can help reduce obesity and promote health. So, you know, perhaps that's another angle on this, that when you're talking about establishing bans, people have a different reaction to it than when you're talking about increasing cost.
And this is Mark Gottlieb. I think also you have a situation here where this was a vote by the people rather than a matter of for a local city council or local legislative body. And I think those groups are generally more likely to be influenced by the personal responsibility and nanny state arguments than the public at large is.
Great questions. And does anyone in the in our viewership and our audience have any additional feedback or thoughts on this? I think that there's a lot. Obviously, there's a lot of differences between the different, as our panelists have pointed out, between the different policies proposed, both in how they're implemented and what they accomplish. But it is interesting and I think very important to be thinking about how some of these arguments play out and how we can counter them too. I mean, I think that that's a big question that comes up for us a lot of times in public health, is thinking about, well, all right, we know we're going to get called food nannies, or we know we're going to get told that we're unfairly regulating choice. So what can we do, or what is the strategy for addressing those arguments, either for preventing them in the first place, or, you know, kind of proactively handling them, or for dealing with them when we're confronted with them in public policy meetings and other situations. I don't have an answer to that, and I don't know that our panelists want to dive into that, down that rabbit hole at this exact moment, but I think it's part of the reason why conversations like this are so important. We don't really have time for much more in the way of questions, but one thought I wanted to kind of bring up as a closing kind of question or thought is, you know, the overwhelming majority of people that are participating today said that they would use health arguments. And so, but we've talked a little bit about, sorry?
Oh, I just wanted to jump in. Pam said that they would use health arguments. There's actually that they would use.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I really need more coffee today. Nobody's restricted. Nobody there is. Luckily, there's a Starbucks down the street. They would use co-benefit arguments. That they would talk about the value of these policies that go beyond community nutrition. And one of the questions or thoughts I had about that, or as I was thinking about that, how it's playing out in my own community, in my own city of Oakland, is who are some partners that we should work with if we're going to seek out opportunities to make arguments that go beyond nutrition? Who are some of the community groups, the stakeholders, the partners that we want to be working with in our efforts to advance these policies? I know that Heather and I were speaking earlier about a local policy in Oakland, both of our home cities of Oakland, that's about limiting the availability of fast food by keeping a McDonald's from being open 24 hours. And I know that there have been environmental groups that have been part of that because their focus is on litter and trash. And there's also been homeowners associations who are talking about property values and light and noise pollution. So I just wanted to open that up as maybe a potential kind of closing question, both for our audience and our panelists, of who are some groups we want to partner with? Who are some other stakeholders to bring into this conversation if we're going to make the arguments about more than health and potentially make them more acceptable to a broader audience?
Well, I'll just say quickly that one thing that we found in the news coverage was that the policies that weren't about nutrition had a lot of support from community residents and from local business owners. And so I think, as you mentioned, those homeowners associations and local chambers of commerce and those kinds of things, I think, would be natural allies to turn to. Heather and Mark, do you have any thoughts about that?
This is Mark. Well, I think those are great suggestions, and any organizations that specialize in community development would be good choices as well. you know, the chambers of commerce have often gotten some funding from the National Restaurant Association and the fast food industry. They may or may not be receptive, but I think that varies at the local level. Also, other businesses that would benefit from an improved visual landscape in their communities would also be, you know, great partners in trying to sort of clean up communities by eliminating the type of traffic and litter that's also associated with these fast food outlets.
Fantastic. Great point. Well, I think with that, we are kind of closing in on the end here, so I want to take the time to thank everyone, to thank all of our panelists, Mark Gottlieb, Heather Wooten, and Laura Nixon, as well as Lucy Friedman from the Public Health Advocacy Institute, who was part of the research and has been graciously sitting in with us today. I want to thank everyone for participating, for the questions that we got, and for the engagement that we got. Our project on this is available. Our paper is available in the American Journal of Public Health. I believe it was published in the January online. It was published online in January. And if you can't find that through searching or need some extra or would like a copy of it and you don't have an AJPH subscription, please get in touch with us and we'll be happy to share that document with you. There's a lot of great additional findings and research to be perused. And I want to thank everyone again for...
And there's also a 2-page memo that we put out that you can access at BMSG's website.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Laura. So there is, in addition, a kind of a policy brief that might be a little shorter, a little more concise, that you can find at bmsg.org. Please do follow up with Laura or myself. We presented our contact information. Or please feel free to also follow up with any of us who presented or spoke today. We're very excited about this work and continuing to think about how we can continue to advance these kinds of policies and these kinds of policy debates. So with that, and again, if you do have additional questions that didn't get answered today, please also feel free to follow up with any of us or via Twitter, you know, the hashtag. So thank you all very, very much. It was a great chat, and enjoy the rest of your day and your long weekend.